Welcome to Magic and Medicine, a bonus series of the Three Ravens podcast, all about superstitious spells, crazy charms, and some downright revolting remedies. I'm Eleanor Conlon, and I'm climbing a tree to cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, and I'm joined by my co-host, Martin Vaux.
Eleanor, I'm slightly worried about you climbing trees. Have you got firm grips? Are you experienced with this sort of thing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I have lots of experience.
Better to be safe than sorry. That's my view.
We are thrilled to be back for our first bonus episode of Series 3 after a little break in the wake of haunting season.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting ready for all things festive, and we have certainly hung up our mistletoe.
Yeah, I'm hoping if I linger under it at just the right moment, I might get a kiss.
You could be lucky. But any mistletoe which features in today's episode has nothing to do with kissing.
Oh.
Because today we're going to be talking about druids. Martin, have you ever met a druid or encountered any druidry in your life?
I don't think I've ever met a druid. I mean, I think I've met one person who said they're a druid, but I wasn't entirely convinced. I've encountered them a lot in writing, in fiction, but I mean, I think they're a bit mysterious. And through the documentaries that I have watched about, life in the ancient past, it seems like what we know about druids is a bit speculative. There's not a whole ton of evidence. So I'm really interested to hear what you've been able to unearth in your research.
Perfect. Now, it's worth saying that I hadn't quite appreciated what a huge topic this was when I started doing the research for this episode. There is a lot to say about the history of druids and the modern practice of druidry. So I really will be only scratching the surface here. I don't claim to be an expert at all and wholeheartedly welcome any more information. So if there's anything you would have liked to be included, anything you know about druids, dear listener, please do write in and let me know.
I mean, that is a general Three Ravens rule. If there are things that we've missed out that you think should have been included, please contact us.
Yes, we love finding out more information. You can never have too much knowledge.
No, indeed.
And I have a feeling that this particular topic is one we could easily return to in more depth. So possibly I'll title this episode Druids Part 1.
That leaves you open to, Return of the Druids at some point.
Which sounds like a frankly amazing action movie, doesn't it? Well, let's see how we get on, but that may well be the case.
Okay, so can we start by defining what a druid is, in case anybody listening isn't familiar with the term?
Absolutely. A druid was historically a high-ranking priest figure in Celtic cultures.
Okay.
In addition to being religious leaders, the druids may have been healers, advisors, and legal authorities. In the modern world, druidry is a spiritual, sometimes but not always religious movement, which promotes relationships with nature and its divine essence.
They really like Stonehenge, don't they, them druids?
They like all sorts of outdoors. Theological beliefs in modern druids vary really widely.
Okay.
But there is this core sense of nature-based spiritual frameworks and a regular practice of connection with nature, often resulting in environmental work as well.
And some pretty cool costumes, gotta say.
Yeah.
So do we know when the druids first originated? Is there a start date for druidry?
We have a slight problem here because early druids left no written accounts of their lore, possibly because it was against their religious doctrine to do so. It seems likely that people in positions of power within society would be literate, so it makes sense that they perhaps weren't allowed to keep written records, which is why we don't have anything. And it's within reasonable conjecture that part of the early druidic training involved memorising stories and rituals, so it makes sense that theirs was a purely oral tradition.
Yeah, of course, because, we talked a little bit about vellum and parchment. Paper, of course, not something that lasted, not something that was around. Written languages, little bit sketchy about how people even wrote and recorded back in the Celtic era. We have concepts like the Ogham alphabet.
Yeah, which we'll talk a bit more about later.
So how do we know what we know if nobody was writing it down?
Well, luckily for us, contemporaries of the druids from other cultures weren't at all shy about recording their experiences and thoughts.
Right, gotcha.
So we have sources from the Greeks and the Romans, so from the classical era, basically. One of the best sources for information about earliest references to druids is actually Julius Caesar.
Famous fan of the optometrist chain Specsavers,
Really?
Yeah, because he came and he saw.
Well,
He actually provided a lot of useful social historical information, though, didn't he, Julius Caesar?
yeah, he did, as well as conquering.
Yes.
Caesar's De Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic Wars, were written from 50 BC after a 9-year campaign against the Gauls.
If you've never read it, it is kind of mind-blowingly awesome as a text. It's
Yeah,
so
it is.
interesting.
It's quite a slog.
Yeah.
It's in several books. And it was actually written as a bit of a publicity stunt, all 7 books of it, to increase Caesar's popularity with the plebeians and protect him from his aristocratic enemies who were trying to get rid of him after the Gallic Wars, basically.
Well, he did have a little bit of a difficult time with pointy objects.
Yeah, he did. Popularity among his peers was not his strong suit. But in addition to talking about battles and tactics and obviously sort of conquering left, right and centre, the Gallic Wars does act as a bit of a travel diary too, because Caesar describes his experiences and the people he meets on his journey.
Okay, so in particular, what do we learn from Caesar about the Gallic Druids then?
Well, he wrote extensively on Druids, and while some of it may have been exaggeration to communicate his own ideas and purposes to the people of Rome, some of it is likely based in fact. It's actually from De Bello Gallico that we get the idea of Druids not using written language. Caesar thought that the Druids' practice of oral transmission of knowledge was both to keep their knowledge from becoming common and also to improve their faculties of memory.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because we see things like that in quite a few different church beliefs. It's not just a Druidic thing. I mean,
no, memorizing the catechism.
Yeah, precisely. You know, I was going to use the example of the Roman Catholic faith. For the longest time, they kept knowledge in Latin and didn't teach other people Latin unless they were of a particular social class.
So it was very protected.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Caesar also suggests it could take up to 20 years to complete Druidic studies.
Oh, that sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Something that deep that it would take 20 years to become a master.
We do know that the Gauls at the time had written language, so it was an active choice that the Druids at that period were making not to write things down, because the Gauls did use Greek letters, but by Caesar's time they'd moved to Latin.
So does Caesar give us any sort of clues about the place of Druids in society? Because in my mind, they're kind of the highest of the high, the holiest of the holy, and maybe are almost kind of outside of society because they're so sacred, but that's just me speculating.
Well, he does. He writes that the Druids were as important as the equites or the nobles in pagan Celtic society. And you're right, they did have a sort of separate hierarchy where they selected a single leader who ruled until his death, with a successor chosen by vote. And he also says that they were exempt from military service and from paying taxes.
Well, obviously there's lots about this that sounds appealing, but also from my understanding, Druids kind of cut across tribes. So whereas, you know, you have a particular leader of a particular tribe, the Druids are a kind of national or almost international order where they can almost be negotiators and peacekeepers between different groups of people. So they kind of have a different status to a regular noble.
Yeah, exactly. You would be able to attend a ritual presided over by a Druid, even if you were from a different tribe, for example. And they did, we think, organise religious ceremonies, sacrifices, divination, and judicial procedure as well. So if you had, you know, a dispute, you might take it to the Druid to have it resolved.
That's really interesting.
And we've got 2 other classical writers, well, more than 2, but 2 I'll talk about right now, who, in mentioning the Druids, we've got Diodorus Siculus and Strabo. They both say, separate accounts in separate centuries, that the Druids were so highly respected that they could stop battles if they intervened.
Yeah, I've heard about this, the idea that they could step out between 2 fighting armies, and the 2 fighting armies would stop.
They would have to stop.
Yeah, they'd have to stop, because to kill a Druid or endanger a Druid was seen as, you know, bad luck for absolutely everyone.
Yeah, it was not a lucky thing to do.
Oh, that's so interesting. So you said that was just 2 other sources. We have 3 sources so far, but are there any others?
Yeah, there are, although none so extensive as Julius Caesar.
Right.
Like, he really goes to town in the Gallic Wars. But Druids and their practices were clearly something the literate classical world was aware of and wanted to write about.
Okay, so being a bit of a language nerd, I'm going to ask a bit of a linguistics question, but the word druid, do we know where that actually comes from?
Well, the word druid in English comes from the Latin druides, which, according to Roman writers, came from the Gaulish word for them.
Oh, okay, so a bit of a circular.
That is the word, I think. We also see it written as druidae in Latin. However, we've also got the words dru in Old Cornish, Drew, or probably the same pronunciation in Middle Welsh, excuse me, my not knowing how to pronounce Middle Welsh, and Druid in Old Irish, all meaning variations of seer or sorcerer.
Oh, awesome. So they are the sorcerer class.
Yes. Some have also suggested that the Proto-Celtic word was druides, meaning oak knower, which links to the importance of trees and nature to druidic practice. So oak knower, somebody who knows the oak.
Yeah, and oak trees, I'm sure we will discuss this, but they are super important to druidic belief. You got to wonder if that's one of those words or word sounds that's ascribed to the object because of the people, or the people are ascribed the word sound the other way around.
Yes, exactly. Very interesting.
Okay, so what else does Caesar have to say about what the Druids actually got up to? Like, what are the headlines according to old Julius Caesar?
Well, he talks about their involvement with theology and cosmology and astronomy. He says that the Druids were concerned with, and this is a quote, the stars and their movements, the size of the cosmos and the earth, the world of nature, and the power and might of the immortal gods.
Awesome.
Which gives us an idea of the Druids as these extraordinarily civilized and learned, almost natural philosophers.
Yeah, that sounds awesome, doesn't it? Fantastic.
Doesn't it? What a pathway.
Yeah.
And he says that actually Britain was the centre of Druidic study, although he's writing from his experiences in Gaul, but he says the Druids met annually at a sacred space.
Oh, well, firstly, I think we've got to doff our caps to Caesar just at this point to say thank you very much for being so thorough in recording
early
this
Druids,
stuff.
nil point for record keeping.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar, 10 points. If he was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Because De Bello Gallico and its accounts of Druidry has been a bit of a bone of contention for scholars of the Druids, in fact.
Oh, really?
Modern historians, including our great hero Ronald Hutton, author of fantastic books, which I highly encourage you to read some of his work if you haven't already, have put forward the view that Caesar manipulated the idea of the Druids and their practices for his own ends.
I mean, to be fair, that is just about what every historian ever has done.
Exactly, yes.
It's what writers do.
Most people come at a historical account with a slight agenda, don't they?
Definitely.
I mean, I don't think there is any such thing as an unbiased historical account.
No, any travel log, likewise, even if it's sort of contemporary history, as it were, describing what it's like to visit a particular nation. If you were to write an account of your holiday, you would describe things in particular ways for good reason.
Yeah, exactly. And some people have suggested that despite talking about the Druids as a significant part of Gallic society, he doesn't mention them in any conquests. And he did quite a lot of conquering in Gaul over that 9-year period. And Ronald Hutton in particular thought that Caesar had presented the Druids as both civilized and barbaric, so that they represented a society worth including in the Roman Empire, which required civilizing with Roman rule and values.
Oh, I see.
So, like, they're worthy of joining because they're intelligent and educated and they've got all these skills and potentially powers, but they still do these barbaric things, so we still need to impose Roman rule.
Okay, so Caesar may have been exaggerating a bit to help justify intended invasion and the imperial project of Rome.
Not every historian thinks so. There's a historian called Miranda Aldhouse Green who's written extensively on the Druids, and she's pointed out that while he might have embellished things a little bit, it was unlikely he would have just made everything up.
No.
As he was accompanied on his conquest tour of Gaul by a lot of other Roman senators who might have mentioned it in their own accounts if he'd been outright lying.
Yeah, very good point. And so what about any other sources? I mean, who else can we rely upon for our information about ancient Druids as they once were?
Oh, I mentioned him already, but Diodorus, author of the astoundingly huge work Bibliotheca Historica between 60 and 30 BC. When I say astoundingly huge, this work was in 40 volumes.
40 volumes?
Diodorus set about to produce the entire history of the world up until that point.
Woof.
And he went about it in an extremely lengthy way.
Yeah, that's
I
a
think
beefy
only
text.
about 15 of them still survived, but still that's pretty impressive.
That's amazing, isn't it?
From how long ago they were. And he says that the Druids were philosophers and learned in religious affairs and that they were honoured in society. We've also got a chap called Pomponius Mela, who was a geographer, an early geographer, a map maker, person who tried to map the world, I suppose, as he knew it. And he was writing around 43 AD. He was the first person to say that the Druids underwent secret training in caves and forests.
Ooh, caves and
Sounds quite exciting, doesn't it?
See, I mean, everything you're talking about kind of appeals to me, Eleanor, vanishing into the forest to memorise long chunks of poetic lore.
It does sound pretty great, doesn't it? We also get a reference in 750 AD in a poem by the Irish monk and saint Blathmac, where...
Solid name.
Blathmac.
Hi, I'm Blathmac.
Where he says of Jesus, he was better than a prophet, more knowledgeable than every druid, a king who was a bishop, and a complete sage.
A little bit on the tautological side there, but I guess that makes a point.
Yeah, so even for a monk in the Christian community, the Druids were considered extremely knowledgeable. So much so that Jesus and Druids are in the same breath there.
No, I mean, I hear you. I don't know. I'm not convinced.
Not convinced by Blathmac.
Well, I mean, if we believe Jesus was the son of a poor carpenter from regional desert nation, he's not going to be as wise as somebody who spent 20 years
in a
training.
secret cave. No, you have got a good point there.
Yep.
Do you remember Nennius?
Yes.
We mentioned him in our Middlesex episode earlier this year. He was the Welsh monk who wrote the Historia Brittonum, who may have been responsible for the whole New Troy thing.
Yes, spelling mistake
Nennius.
Yeah.
Well, he relates the story of Vortigern, who was a 5th century warlord and king of Kent, who invited 12 Druids to help him after he was excommunicated from the Christian community at that time, which is interesting because it suggests possible Druidic survival in Britain after the Roman invasion.
Ooh.
And potentially at the same time as Christianity is active within Britain. Although Nennius was writing in the 9th century and could have been engaged in a flight of imagination.
Yeah, in terms of surviving Druids, I mean, I don't know if this is something that you're planning to touch on later, but I remember there was a massive sacrifice and enormous slaughter of Druids by the Romans invading Anglesey.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of one big historic moment that I am familiar with. But I also remember reading that Druids were involved in human sacrifice, or likely were involved in human sacrifice. And obviously that's a bit controversial. Now, do we have any kind of basis in fact for this human sacrifice idea? Because I'm imagining if you were writing about a foreign type of holy cast and you wanted to cast aspersions about them, saying, oh, well, they kill other human beings for their gods, we must therefore do away with them, is quite a good way of kind of belittling them and making them seem lesser.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and sure, I think we don't know for sure. As you say, Roman and Greek writers certainly make a lot of references to Druids as practitioners of human sacrifice, but it could be imperialist propaganda with the conquerors projecting what they saw as barbaric traits onto the people they wanted to invade to kind of justify their conquests and confirm what they saw as their own superiority.
It's complicated, isn't it? Because we know that the Greeks and Romans were more than happy to kill people. But yeah, it's very much part of the game for them. Whether it was part of their religious practice, a little bit more debatable.
I guess that's the difference, isn't it? They go, oh, well, we're so much better because we don't do it as part of our religious practice.
But, you know, we can talk about Vestal virgins and we can talk about, you know, Pyrrhic sacrifice. So that definitely happened in, you know, the quote-unquote classical world. And also, archaeological evidence of ritual death has been found all over Europe. Like, we have physically seen some examples in museums. And that kind of strongly points to Iron Age Celts practicing human sacrifice in some ways.
Yeah, those graves can't all be honoured warriors, can they?
Like, for example, bog bodies. We have talked about this before. The Lindo man, that's a famous one. He has these marks of what appear to be violent death, his body then cast into water. And we've talked about this idea a few times on Three Ravens, this idea of water as a transitional kind of space where you pass something into water, whether that's a body or an object, and it passes from our world into the other world, the afterlife, to be useful there.
Well, Caesar says that Druids did prefer to use criminals as sacrificial victims rather than innocent members of society, which is somewhat heartening. But then he also describes victims being burned alive in a large wooden and wicker effigy.
Summa is ecumenin.
Yeah, where have we heard that one before? So whether or not he's being accurate or he's just giving the makers of the Wicker Man a great idea for several centuries later, unfortunately it is pretty hard to find archaeological evidence of large wicker men when it's literally gone up in smoke. So we do have to leave that one to conjecture. However, there are frequent enough references to human sacrifice being part of Druidic rituals for us to infer there was maybe some basis in fact.
It wouldn't surprise me, I've got to say. For the culture of the time, it seemed like killing people was kind of bread and butter.
Yeah, kind of normal. And we have this account in the 10th century which talks about the threefold death.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. What's the threefold death?
Well, it states that sacrifices to the deities Tutates, also known as Mercury, Esus, also known as Mars, and Tyrannus, also known as Jupiter, should be by drowning, hanging, and burning. The historian and expert on Iron Age religion, Anne Ross, proposed that the Lindoman bog body actually was an example of the threefold death human sacrifice ritual. Because he had his throat cut, he was strangled, and he was hit on the head. And he may have then been an offering to several different gods.
I mean, on the one hand, that is kind of unpleasant, but it's also absolutely fascinating.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And then as you say, the body was put into water as well, so that could be another layer to that.
I got to say, and this may be from reading and watching lots of fantasy, but I have always associated Druids with augury and predicting the future. Do we have any evidence on that?
That definitely comes up too, yes. Cicero actually said he knew a Gaulish Druid who claimed to have that knowledge of nature, which the Greeks call physiologia. And he used to make predictions, sometimes by means of augury and sometimes by means of conjecture.
Conjecture!
We can all do that, Cicero.
Yeah, indeed.
And Diodorus Siculus writes about Druids attending sacrifices to the gods as intermediaries between the human and the divine, able to interpret signs they received. I'm going to read you this section from Bibliotheca Historica because it's very vivid.
Excellent.
These men predict the future by observing the flight and calls of birds and by the sacrifice of holy animals. All orders of society are in their power, and in very important matters they prepare a human victim, plunging a dagger into his chest. By observing the way his limbs convulse as he falls and the gushing of his blood, they are able to read the future. Blimey.
I mean, that's quite unambiguously making the case for Druids engaging in human sacrifice, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, it was an absolutely insane work in 40 volumes, and Diodorus was nothing if not thorough, but I will leave our listeners to decide if they believe him or not.
Okay, Eleanor, you are talking about predicting the future. I am going to make a series of predictions now. I think that you will talk about the Druids' relation to mistletoe, which is really important for this time of year and all times of years. I'm hoping that you will talk about femininity and Druids, because I have big questions about whether, for example, women can become Druids. And then I'm also, and I think this is a bit of an easy one, but I am going to guess that you are going to talk to us about how the Celtic revival connects to modern beliefs around Druidry. Am I right about these things?
You will find out right after this. Now, you covered some of this in your super interesting Mega Mabon special on the autumn equinox, where you delved into the wonders of Irish folklore. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there are a lot of references to Druids in medieval Irish tales, even once Ireland was Christianised.
Yes, now Druids pop up a lot as advisors to lords and kings there. often with the gift of prophecy and occasionally with other magical abilities too. One character that we definitely link to the concept of the Druid is, of course, Merlin. He's sort of a ubiquitous wizard who appears in a lot of the Grail cycle.
Yes, we've got Merlin, and we've also got the character of Cathbad, who's the chief druid in the court of Ulster and pops up in several different tales. So he's sort of travelling, as you mentioned, druids travelling between tribes.
Yes.
Cathbad travels between folk tales. You've probably heard the tale Deirdre of the Sorrows, which is quite a famous one in the Ulster cycle. She's a tragic heroine figure, and her story is kicked off by the prophecy of that druid that Deirdre would grow up to be very beautiful, that kings and lords would go to war over her, blood would be shed because of her, and Ulster's 3 greatest warriors would be forced into exile for her sake.
It's quite a lot to hang around a person's neck, isn't it?
Yeah, you can imagine why she feels a bit sorrowful,
yeah,
frankly.
Indeed.
And this prophecy, totally ignored by the king, of course came true. So true speaking augury there about these really big life-changing things. But we also have other examples in the Irish mythological cycle, including druids raising magical storms to prevent enemies landing their ships.
Yeah, absolutely classic one, the raising of a storm. So there's this idea of mystical power in addition to a close connection to the gods.
Yes. Of course, once Ireland is Christianised, Druids appear as sorcerers who are trying to oppose Christianity and get in the way of saints. So there's a description in a story of the life of St. Columba of Druids raising clouds and mist and creating fences of protection to stop St. Columba and St. Patrick progressing and converting people.
Yeah, likely. Chinny chin chin, I'd say to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that there's this sort of linking notion of using the weather. The connection of the Druids to nature is so powerful that they can actually manipulate it.
Yeah, I mean, we see that with witches, though, as well, don't we?
Yeah.
Lots of witches are accused of summoning storms or manipulating the weather, when very often it may be that A, they're lucky guessers, B,
the weather is unpredictable.
Yeah, the weather is unpredictable. But also that it's a kind of thing to hang around their necks when something bad happens.
And it's very difficult to prove they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Once the weather's gone, you can't exactly interrogate it.
No, that's very true.
And we've also got in the Fenian cycle a number of druid characters, including Bormal, who is a lady druid who helps bring up Phil McCall.
Get in. One of my guesses correct. Ladies can be druids. Now, I don't know why, but I have always associated the idea of druids with the kind of image of a man with a long white beard.
No, ladies can absolutely be druids.
That is cool.
A famous one, but she's not the only one in the Fenian cycle. There's quite a few. They're often daughters of noted male druids, but not always. Sometimes they're simply druids in their own right, and they just have the same powers, the same respect in their society.
I love that. See, I'm really interested.
In folk tales, anyway.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the role magic seems to play, at least in folk tales, because it seems to me that as though there's a bit of a crossover between the religious practice of druidry and this idea of being a sorcerer or being a magician, a wizard of some kind.
Yeah, there's also a bit of conflation in the modern world with Wicca. There's a number of similarities between the two paths, and some people even combine Druid and Wiccan ideas and practices, just as other people combine different spiritual ways with Druidry.
Okay, so my spidey sense is tingling here. We're talking about Druidry coming back to life again. I mean, we know that there are modern Druids, don't we?
Yes, we do. Every solstice, we see a nice photograph of them at Stonehenge celebrating, don't we? But it's much wider than I thought it was when I started looking into this.
Really?
Yeah, so census data from 2013, which is obviously 10 years ago now, had the Druid population of the Anglophone world at 59,299. So it likely exceeds that now 10 years later.
Wow. See, that's quite an interestingly high number, and yet there is a long time when we don't really hear anything about the Druids at all, isn't there? Like, presumably, Christianity starts to dominate, Druidry falls away, And then we go through, I guess, what we call the early modern era. And people aren't writing about Druids during that period of time.
Indeed, no. Really, from the 7th century onwards, with the widening spread of Christianity through Western Europe and Celtic countries, we don't hear a lot from or about Druids then until the 18th century, when there's a revival in interest in their history.
So that seems maybe slightly ahead of the Romantic Celtic revival, but only a little bit.
It is, but the one certainly blossoms into the other. I mean, interest in Scottish Gaelic culture greatly increased in the late 18th century, which we can partly thank Sir Walter Scott for.
Well, we can also thank Irish nationalism, because that's what was bubbling underneath.
Completely.
You know, poets like Thomas Moore collecting folk songs, you know, Irish melodies and so on and so forth. Now, we must tell you, talking about Walter Scott, that while Eleanor and I love literature and Scott theoretically falls right into my area of interest, we both struggle a little bit with Sir Walter Scott.
Yeah, definitely not my cup of tea. Luckily, he's far from the only person getting involved in this Gaelic revival. There's James Macpherson's Ossian, and you mentioned Thomas Moore.
Yeah.
And we can even see at this point in time a great revival of interest in folk songs, with popular composers like Beethoven creating arrangements of Scottish folk songs, folk dances starting to appear in the ballrooms of the wealthy, and this sort of growing sense of Celtic identity.
Yeah.
You've talked about Irish nationalism, and I think that really rises up at this point, doesn't it? You start seeing Celtic-inspired patterns appearing in art, and this romantic sense of the past, a connection to nature and humanity's sort of more natural state, the noble savage, all of that stuff becomes really sought after.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's partly to do with the Industrial Revolution, blossoming and blooming, the Age of Enlightenment, and so on and so forth. I mean,
rolling right into your friends, the Romantic poets.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, William Blake, as an example, he actually has a vague connection to Druidry, and the Ancient Order actually claims that William Blake was their chosen chief at the time. But, I mean, there's no evidence in anything Blake really did to suggest that this is true.
No, he was not the chosen chief of the ancient Druid order. I think it's more likely he was in the vicinity of the Druidic revival. It certainly interested him enough to write about it, and he does write about it. He was kind of Druid adjacent.
Yeah, he wasn't a chief, though.
No, he was definitely friends with people who attended the first Gorseth of Bards on Primrose Hill in London in 1792, though, although there's no record of him being present himself.
Okay. What is the Gorseth of Bards, Eleanor?
Well, it all stems from this interesting but rather dubious character, Iolo Morganwg.
Well, you were just talking about James Macpherson. I mean, he's a dodgy character. When we talk about Ossian, the basic idea of the Ossianic poetry is somebody coming along and saying, I've found all of these ancient poems, presenting them as if they're real, and everyone going, oh my God, there's this whole balladic, folkloric tradition of these ancient heroes from the past, becomes a bestseller. Turns out he didn't find them at all. They aren't old. He just wrote them, made them up, and faked the whole thing. Am I basically on the right track? Is this guy, Iolo Morganwg, the same sort of chap?
Well, in some ways, Iolo, whose real name, by the way, was Edward Williams, was a force for good, as he championed the Druidic revival, and some of the traditions that he put forward are still used today. However, he has also been called hateful by noted grammarian Sir John Morris Jones, who said it would be an age before our history and literature are clean of the traces of his dirty fingers.
Oh, naughty Edward. I mean, Iolo. Now, you got me properly intrigued. What did Edward get up to?
Well, you are quite right. He is 100% in the Macpherson camp of things. He was a Welsh antiquarian and a poet in the 18th and early 19th century, and he supposedly discovered a number of historical and poetic manuscripts.
They were all about it
Yeah,
at this
they were
time.
all about it. He founded this secret society called the Gorseth, which is a society of Welsh poets, writers and musicians. Supposedly, their activities are based on real historical activities of the Druids. But it was discovered after his death that Iolo had actually forged a lot of the manuscripts and simply invented things.
I mean, amazing. Like, full credit to him because he got away with it, at least in his lifetime. But I think this has had a really serious impact on certainly English culture, but maybe even European and Western culture?
Well, the Druidic philosophies that Iolo Morganwg essentially made up had a huge impact. And the Gorseth, the idea of the Gorseth has grown to become the modern Eisteddfod festival, which celebrates the arts, and its ideas continue to permeate modern Druidic culture. Yeah, I mean, the Eisteddfod itself does have genuine roots in the ancient past, but I think the way it's celebrated today partially comes from the Gorseth and its rituals, and those are Iola's invention.
Wow. Okay, so what is you just used a word, Eisteddfod?
The Eisteddfod. Well, in Druidry, it's a specific ceremony dedicated to the recitation of poetry and of musical performances. Among the Druidic community, it's often believed that bards should be divinely inspired in producing their work. But in Wales today, the national Eisteddfod is this huge festival of the arts celebration, which is not limited to Welsh language culture anymore. It used to be, but I think it's a bit more open these days.
I'm just kind of sitting here vibrating slightly with rage to know that it would appear that a lot of what we understand as Druidry comes from a fraudster.
I mean, he undoubtedly was inspired by his knowledge of Welsh folklore and literature. It was the kind of forgery that only a real scholar could produce.
Oh, well, that's fine then. That's fine.
He made a lot up, but he did a lot of research and created this very original artistic body of work. He was so good that it took nearly 100 years after his death for academics to conclusively prove he'd fabricated his material.
Yeah, okay, fair play. So he really dedicated himself to cheating everyone.
Yeah, but although he was a fraud, yes, his lasting legacy has been quite positive, I would say.
What's sort of as an act of poetry positive?
Yeah. I think it's super interesting in the context of modern Druidry, actually, because one of its key principles is creativity.
Okay, yeah.
Hear me out. The Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, which, incidentally, uses those 3 ranks of membership because those were the ones established by Iolo Morganwg in his Gorseth, says that it works with Druidry as a spiritual way and practice which speaks to 3 of our greatest yearnings: to be fully creative in our lives, to commune deeply with the world of nature, and to gain access to a source of profound wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting, but it's just some guy who's made it up. If it's not based on fact, that's uncomfortable.
They fully admit as well. They say, although he did make it up, the key principles are ones that we quite want to follow.
That's so interesting, but... my goodness. Now, Eleanor, if we've got time, I want to ask about the Druids and the Ogham alphabet. Now, Eleanor gave me a beautiful set of Ogham tree staves not long ago. Each of those is marked with a different glyph in the Ogham alphabet, each made of the wood of the corresponding tree. It's an extremely beautiful thing. And I know there is a system of tree lore in the Celtic tradition. Is that an invention of this guy, or does that have roots to something earlier?
No. So tree lore is important to many Druids, with each tree having different associations to moods, deities, energies, planets, phases of life. And those different tree species are often linked to the Ogham alphabet.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I have been studying right now. So, yeah, it's very interesting.
This is used by Druids in divination, and... You're all right. It does have a genuine historical past.
It did, yeah.
It's an early medieval alphabet, which was primarily used to write the early Irish language. And the names of the trees can be ascribed to its letters too. For example, the letter Dare, which means oak. And on your set of staves, Dare is carved onto the stave made of oak wood. And many modern Druids may still use the Ogham in divination or in other rituals, although some prefer the alternative, Celbrin.
Oh, I haven't heard of the Celbrin.
It's a different bardic alphabet, vaguely similar to ancient Greek, and invention of Iolo Morganwg.
This guy just made it up.
I'm afraid he did. He made it up. He created wooden framed versions and presented them to people, passing them off as real druidic artifacts.
This man, he's naughty. Edward. We should start calling him Edward. His name isn't Iola. We've all got that friend who's changed their name to something like arty and funky that isn't their actual name. and if it turns out that they're a sneak, then you just need to call them by their original name. So Edward with his made-up alphabet.
You do have to shake your head. Let's something admirable about such a large-scale fraud too, isn't there?
Well, maybe, but not in a religious sense. I think people are throwing serious life energy into these kind of systems of belief. It's just some rando making stuff up. I don't know, I'm pretty freaked out. Okay, Eleanor, so let's say I want to become a druid. Now, earlier you mentioned something about 20 years of study. Like, do we have anywhere a sense of what is involved in my 20-year process to train to become a druid?
Well, luckily for you, you no longer have to spend 20 years studying. Traditionally, it would have taken that time, but many of the skills which would have been taught in that time are skills that you have already, like reading, writing and memorising, for example.
Okay, yeah.
You can actually do the training by correspondence course today. Why is that funny?
A correspondence course?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem terribly connected to nature and the woods and the caves to me.
Well, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids provides all the resources.
What, like via email?
Yep, or by post. Correspondence course.
Am I the only one thinking this is insane?
I mean, I'm sure if you wanted to, you could phone them up and have a nice conversation with a druid.
Yeah, but even so, surely there's a problem. If you've got like an orally passed down tradition that is based on the principle that people hold this knowledge so sacred that you have to only speak it and memorize it and then pass it on to the next generation, the idea that you could send it as a PDF, there's something a bit messed up about that, isn't there?
Well, unfortunately, the oral thing was blown completely apart by Edward.
Yeah, well,
and it's absolutely been written down since then. So you can totally have it as a PDF.
But I mean, is modern druidic belief then based primarily about what Edward came up with?
Yes and no. I think there has been an effort to seek out older sources. And then there are, if Julius Caesar's to be believed, there are plenty of practices that the Iron Age Celtic Druids got up to that you maybe don't want to emulate today. I mean, you'd be arrested for a start if you built a large wicker man and started stuffing people you didn't like into it. But
maybe.
Yes, I think there is a degree of Iolo still permeating. He wrote a Druidic prayer which was used at the opening of his Gorseth rituals, which many Druids do still use today.
I feel very conflicted. I would like to hear from some Druids about how they feel about this idea of their faith kind of being spun out by somebody who's written a fiction.
So I think it's important to make the distinction between Druidic practice as a faith, because not all people who are Druids and identify as Druids are religious.
Yeah, okay.
It can just be a spiritual pathway without being a strictly theological pathway. So the connection to nature, the feeling divinely inspired by nature, wanting to live a creative life, perhaps being concerned for the state of the planet, particularly at the moment. None of those things are to do with theology.
No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, that does tick a lot of boxes for me personally. I guess the big question is, can you be a druid and really hate Edward? Because at the moment, I've got a bit of a burning dislike.
I think you can.
Okay,
I think plenty do.
Well then, people, watch this space. I may yet train to become a druid.
Well, it takes a minimum of 3 years, which is a bit more manageable. So maybe if you're looking for something new and you've finished your masters.
Yeah.
Now, we started the podcast today by talking about mistletoe.
I knew you were going to talk about mistletoe. Woohoo!
Which we know the Druids held sacred and valued highly. It was likely used in many rituals and believed to have magical properties. It's thought that the plant offers protection against evil, as well as being linked to fertility because of its spontaneous generation.
Yes. This is in
if you were looking to conceive, you might wear a sprig of mistletoe somewhere on your body.
Yeah, this is in part because mistletoe grows without the soil. So it grows on trees, and therefore it seemed like a magical thing. So it's a really important plant because it can be poisonous. It can help with fertility. It has this strange status where it's almost its own life force and also liminal in the same way that water is between life and death and healing.
But it is essentially a parasite, isn't it?
Yeah, basically.
It grows on other plants. Now, you probably have your own views by now on Lindo Man and how he died, and whether or not his death was part of a ritual sacrifice. But I will say this. Archaeologists found traces of mistletoe pollen in his stomach, so we know that mistletoe was connected to his death in some way.
Yeah, so cool. It's a mistletoe mystery. I love it.
I'm going to leave you with this incredible description of a Druid rite involving mistletoe growing on an oak tree, which was written in the 1st century AD by Pliny the Elder.
Ooh.
The Druids hold nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and a tree on which it is growing, provided it is a hard timbered oak. Mistletoe is rare, and when found it is gathered with great ceremony, and particularly on the 6th day of the moon. Hailing the moon in a native word that means healing all things, they prepare a ritual sacrifice and banquet beneath the tree and bring up 2 white bulls whose horns are bound for the first time on this occasion. A priest arrayed in white vestments climbs the tree and with a golden sickle cuts down the mistletoe, which is caught in a white cloak. Then finally they kill the victims, praying to a god to render his gift propitious to those on whom he has bestowed it. They believe that mistletoe given in drink will impart fertility to any animal that is barren, and that it is an antidote to all poisons.
Oh, wow, that is so beautiful.
Isn't
and
it?
so interesting.
I think it captures some of the beauty and the mystery of these traditional rituals from an observer's perspective, and perhaps explains in part why people have been so intrigued by the Druids for centuries.
Oh, wow, thank you so much, Eleanor. That was super interesting, but I think you're right when you say there has to be a part 2, because didn't even touch on Anglesey.
We didn't, so that's for next time.
Yeah.
I really have only scratched the surface.
Oh, fascinating.
But I hope that those who were as new to the topic as I was found it interesting. And if you've actually read anything interesting about Druids, or even if you've chosen to follow the path yourself,
well, especially if you're following the path yourself, I'd be so interested.
do please get in touch with us if you're happy to share your experiences at 3ravenspodcast@gmail.com. Tell us all about them.
Oh, yes, please. That's also the place to send us your thoughts on the podcast in general and your own tales of wonder and dread. Or you can get in touch with us on social media via all the normal places: facebook.com/3Ravens Podcast, Instagram at 3Ravens Podcast, and X or Twitter at 3Ravens Pod.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/3Ravens Podcast. We have lots of exclusive goodies on there, and a new monthly newsletter for December has just come out. Otherwise, we will be back on Monday for our usual tour of the historic counties of England, and there'll be a brand new bestiary episode on Thursday.
Oh, I also want to remind everyone about our brand new 3 Ravens Flash Fiction competition. Send us an original story with a folky atmosphere, folky ideas, up to 1,000 words, and then we're going to put them all together in a special episode so everyone can enjoy one another's work.
We are so excited to read your stories.
We really are. Until next time, though, while our mistletoe's fallen that way, we'll go this way.
And remember, don't whistle till you're out of the woods. Our theme song is the traditional folk ballad 3 Ravens, performed by Eleanor Conlon and Ben Harbour, and our logo is by Ollie James Dare.
The 3 Ravens Podcast is a Rust and Stardust production, produced by me, Martin Vaux. Thanks for listening.
God sent every gentleman, such hounds, such hawks, and such leman, with a down derry